Joining us now from Capitol Hill, member of the Intel Committee, Independent Senator Angus King of Maine. Senator, good morning. Always good to see you. We've been talking this morning and listening to some of your Republican Senate colleagues effectively dismissing what they've heard from some of the prosecutors' reports and as well as the Mueller documents that we've seen that have given us some window into the special counsel's investigation, saying, I don't believe Michael Cohen is a witness. Orrin Hatch going so far as to say, Donald Trump's been a good president. I'm not worried about what I've read and what I've seen. What's your response to your colleagues in the Senate?
Well, I think there are several responses. Let's talk about Mr. Mueller first. I thought the filing last week that really should chill the White House most thoroughly was the one from Michael Flynn, because he's at the heart, or was certainly in the room where it happens, if you will, on the relationship between the Trump campaign, if any, and the Russians. He was in Moscow at dinner with Vladimir Putin in December of 2015. He was a high advisor to the president throughout the campaign into the transition. We know during the transition he was in touch with the Russians. And I think what's a little chilling for the White House about that is that he obviously is giving a great deal of information to the special counsel. They recommended no jail sentence, a kind of prosecutorial pardon, if you will, and there was a lot of material redacted. So that goes to really the heart of what relationship, if any, there was between the campaign and the Russians. That's the one I think is the most serious. What happened in the Southern District of New York with Michael Cohen is also serious. It's a felony, but it's of a different order. And I think the discussion really should sort of wait until we see the full scope of what the Mueller investigation and our investigation at the Senate Intelligence Committee comes up with.
Senator King, I want to ask you for a sense of what's going on in your home state of Maine with regard to all of this. It's like a fire hose of news events every day.
It sure is.
But I suspect that most people up in Brunswick, Maine, or Portland, Maine, aren't walking around tweeting all day and everything like that. But when you go home, can you speak at all to the sense of exhaustion that many people might be feeling about all of this, exhaustion and frustration?
Well, I think people are frustrated, and it breaks into groups. We had, in some cases, my election is sort of a microcosm of where people are. My Republican opponent got 35%. I think that represents a hardcore Republican Trump base. My Democratic opponent got a little bit over 10%. That's the sort of progressive Democratic base. Unfortunately, I got the rest. But there is a third of the state, just as there is a third of the country, who believes the president is under siege improperly and all those kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons I think we have to wait and see the full scope of what the president is charged with. To be talking about impeachment now only will inflame that third of the country. They'll feel it's a kind of coup or revenge or something like that. Impeachment is a very high standard in my view. And so people are, I think one way to put it is people are waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Senator, good morning. Steve Schmidt here. You serve as one member in a body of 100 people, known formerly as the world's greatest deliberative body.
Yeah.
We've seen the remarkable occasion of 44 former United States senators, men and women of both parties, write an open letter to the country, to the Senate, talking about the Senate's really institutional failures at this moment and the possible threat to the American Republic and American democracy with the abdication of duty. Would you react to that letter? What is its impact, if any, inside the United States Senate? What have your colleagues said about it? How extraordinary did you find it?
I found it quite extraordinary, particularly when you went down that list and saw who those people were. It was a very bipartisan group and a serious group, people that have made a real impact on this country. One, by the way, Bill Cohen from Maine, of course, was one of the key House members. He was one of the 6 Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee that voted for the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And that was an important moment. And here was a guy who was willing to stand up against his party and do what he thought was right. So his signature on that letter was especially meaningful to me, knowing that bit of history. And I think it's important that we be reminded every now and then that it isn't all about politics. It isn't all about, winning the next election or who's up or who's down or who's going to control the Senate. There really is an institutional responsibility here, and it goes back deeply into American history. The Senate has that role to sort of look closely at these issues and play a leveling role in policy decisions, and that letter really was extraordinary. The other thing about it was political. To see all the Democrats from states that no longer have Democratic representation in the Senate and how our politics have become more regional. There, other than Susan Collins, no Republicans in New England. Now that Bill Nelson's gone, no Democrats south of Virginia in the Southeast. So I think that's a disturbing trend that was sort of underlined by the people that signed that letter.
So, Senator, the president's in the middle of a tweet storm about the border wall, border security. Are we going to get to an agreement on the wall?
Well, I hope so. And here's the thing about the wall that I think I haven't heard discussed very often. The issue with immigration now is not people swimming across the river and sneaking into the country illegally. These caravans, these people that are coming, are asylum seekers who are coming to ports of entry. They're coming to the gates, and putting a wall across southern Arizona or Texas or New Mexico isn't going to affect that. The other fact is that 40% of the illegal aliens in the country today are here because they overstayed their visas. In other words, they got here legally. This is a long way of saying that the wall isn't the answer to the immigration question that we're facing today. There was a time when there were a lot of people, breaking into the country, in effect. That's not happening anymore. These asylum seekers are coming to places where they're supposed to be. They're not trying to climb over a wall. So it's just not the right solution. It doesn't make sense economically. $15–20 million a mile. So there are a lot of better ways to secure the border. One other thing, and one of the president's tweet this morning said this. He's making it sound like you're either for the wall or open borders. That's
right.
Nonsense. Nobody I know here is for open borders. I voted, along with 2/3 of the Senate in 2013, for the strongest border security provision ever attempted by the Congress as part of the comprehensive immigration reform. Nobody's for open borders. It's a question of smart border control, doing it in a humane and sensible way that also makes sense for the American taxpayers.
All right, Senator Angus King, always good to see you and have you on the show. Thank you very much for being on.
Thanks, Mika.
All right, Doris, I just, as you study presidents and you study this president and try and keep up with whatever parallels that you see in history, what specific things have President Donald Trump done that are unprecedented in American history? What's the list? Where are we really off the charts here?
Well, I think what we're off the charts are on the leadership strengths that most presidents at their best exhibit. Humility being one, the ability to acknowledge errors and learn from your mistakes. He seems to think that that's a terrible weakness and has been unable to do that. Most importantly, empathy is the most important quality I think that a leader in a presidency, leader anywhere, has to have, to understand other people's points of view and look with them empathetically. The ability to understand loss and learn from it. He argues that he's never lost. That's why he's the best temperament for anyone who's ever been president. Of course he's lost. There's been bankruptcy. There's been the loss of his brother. If you can't absorb that, then there's something about you that can't grow. The ability to not grow in office. The ability to somehow control your emotions. Lincoln used to get mad at people and he'd write hot letters to them, waiting for them to cool down psychologically. FDR would make these terrible speeches in private about people he thought were traitors inside the administration, isolationists, and then he would never actually say them in the actual speeches. They understood that importance. But most importantly, I think what all the presidents that I've studied who are at their best, somewhere along the line, the ambition for self becomes an ambition for the greater good. No longer is it I anymore. It's we. It's the country. It's the institution. And we keep waiting for that moment to happen for President Trump. And I wonder how long we're ever going to wait. You have to have self-reflection. You have to have an internal sense of dignity. You have to have character to make that happen. So
Doris,
I try to be hopeful and keep waiting. Something will change. There'll be a moment when he realizes, I'm president. I'm not just campaigning. And we wait and we wait and we wait.
And of course, that will never, ever happen. Because we have as a president a man of unprecedentedly loathsome and despicable character. And I think about the country's greatest president, and somebody you've studied, Lincoln, and upon the occasion of his assassination, somebody who was so skeptical of Lincoln at the beginning of his tenure, William Tecumseh Sherman, the great Union general, is asked to reflect on his life. And he says of Lincoln, he says, "I've met all the great men of the world, the industrialists, the kings, the emperors, but I never met any person possessing more of the qualities of greatness and goodness of Abraham Lincoln." And what we have is the antithesis of that in the White House. We have a small man, a vile man, a mean man, a corrupt man, a dishonest man. There will be no growth. There will be no slowing down of any of it. What we're going to see in the months and the year ahead is the resiliency of the American constitutional system, our Republican form of government, which has endured since 1787 and singularly was designed by the genius of our founding fathers in anticipation of the moment when we would have a man like Donald Trump as president. It would not have surprised the founding fathers that we have a president like Trump. Maybe the only thing that would have surprised them is it took this long to get there. But now we'll see the test of all of the mechanisms of our system as we confront what increasingly seems to be an illegitimate and criminal regime in the American White House.
And Lincoln
Schmidt.
worried about that precise thing. And in an address, he said the answer to it was to go back and remember the ideals of the revolution and to teach them to your kid every night like you're reading the Bible. And then you'll put that against the idea of such a person being in power who's trying to tear down rather than build up. He saw that happening in the 1830s. He warned against it. And that was the answer, to go back to history, go back to the things that we know.
And Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you both for being on this morning. And still ahead on Morning Joe, British Parliament is always a little peculiar to the American eye, but particularly yesterday when one member grabbed a 5-foot ceremonial mace from the chamber in protest of Theresa May's decision to call off her Brexit vote. He was expelled from the room amid shouts from both sides of the debate. We'll check on where UK politics land on The Economist's preview of the world in 2019. That's coming up. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.